if Latzi wants to say anything at this point. All right, that's great. I hope everyone can hear me. So as Latzi said, my name is Philip Chen, and I'm one of the lecturers at Royal Holloway in the Department of Biological Sciences. So my general interest is looking at neurobiology, and I'm especially interested in the way neurons communicate with each other. So what I'm going to do is just give you a general run through about the brain, and then follow on to one of the more kind of complex aspects the brain is responsible for, which is really the process of developing memory, and what makes it quite unique as a structure in terms of biology. Okay, so I'll just go through some general kind of basic points. So this is a typical brain in a typical human being. And just to kind of highlight a few general facts about the brain itself. So it's about 1.5 kg in weight. Okay, so relatively in terms of the total body weight is actually quite a small proportion of that weight. However, despite that small proportion, it actually receives about 16% of the total blood supply around the cardiovascular system. So it actually needs quite a lot of blood to keep it functioning normally. Okay. Oops.
This is a student announcement. If Gundarj Gill from 7M is still on the premises, please come to the school office. Gundarj Gill from 7M, please come to the school office. Thank you.
The brain itself is composed of different types of cells. Okay, some of these cells are involved directly in generating or communicating information between cells. These would be especially the neurons. Some of the cells are just there to provide kind of structural support. Those would be more the glia or the oligodendrocytes. I'm not going to talk too much about those cells. I'm going to really focus more on the neuron, okay? And that's the main functional cell type that's present within the brain. Basically, that's the bit that people are more interested in because that's the one that's involved in most of the more complex processes which are needed for general neuronal function. Okay, so moving away from that generalization, what about the brain? How do we define the brain itself? So if we take out the skull and we take out the brain itself, this is basically what the brain itself looks like. Now, obviously, it's not colored. We've only colored that to kind of give you an indication that there are different regions of the brain which are responsible for different types of general processes. Okay? So just to kind of give you a general indication, for example, the parietal lobe at the top of the brain, colored in green, that tends to be a place where sensory information, so your sensation of touch, that is located at the top there. Now you notice there's a bit right at the back of the brain called the occipital lobe. Now that is the place where most visual information, the information that's coming from your eyes, it's all processed at the back there, okay? And you notice there's a kind of a smaller brain, which is located at the bottom part of the brain called the cerebellum. That part of the brain is involved in most of the kind of general control, coordination of motor control and maintains balance within the body. So there are general areas which are responsible for particular general functions. that people know about already in terms of neuronal function. And then connected to the brain itself is the spinal cord. Okay. Now, obviously, you know that's the spinal cord runs all the way down the back, and that from that spinal cord it's able then to connect to the rest of the body. Okay. So, and that the rest of the body, the connections to the rest of the body is often referred to as the peripheral nervous system. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today is really focus more on the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is involved with the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are the connections which connect and control everything else that's going on in your peripheral tissue. All right, so that would include anything, for example, your heart rate, right, your breathing, right, your digestion. All of that is being controlled by the peripheral nervous system. All right, all the things that are going on inside your bodies and you're not really thinking about it. So, for example, you don't have to think about breathing or your heartbeat. All right, that is all happening automatically, and that's all controlled by the peripheral nervous system. But what we're really going to focus on is looking at the central nervous system and some of the spinal cord. That's really what we're going to look at in more detail today. Just sit down.
Drag it along to the other side.
It's okay. I don't mind dragging it.
So use your mouse.
It's not moving this. What do you want to drag it? Just drag it onto that side. That's probably a bit easier. Yeah, that's great. That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, so if we cut the brain in half, we also have different types of structures. So, and in particular, what I really want to focus on is this structure in the middle, which is called the hippocampus. All right, that's really what I'm going to focus this talk about today. All right, and the reason we're going to talk about that is that is the region which we know is involved in memory formation. Right, that's very important for memory formation. And I'll provide some evidence of that over the next few slides. Okay. But the point really is just to highlight the fact you've got different areas and there are different glands in the brain which are responsible for neuronal control, hormonal control, and generally lots of other kind of controls which are necessary for normal development and function. Okay, so I mentioned before the main building blocks are the neurons, right? They're the main thing which are important for normal neuronal function. So what you've got here on the left is an example of a neuron and what it looks like. It's a bit of a weird type of cell. You notice that it's got a cell nucleus and it's got a lot of projections coming out of it, okay? And firstly, it's got a cell body, and from that cell body, there are these very fine protrusions, right, emerging from it, and these are known as dendrites. So these are the sites where other neurons are able to form connections and communicate from one cell to another. You'll notice from the cell body itself, there's a very long cable-like structure, okay, and that's known as the axon, okay? And then the axon itself then emerges and it then forms kind of nerve terminals. And it's these axon terminals which are able to fuse or connect with the dendrites and therefore communicate from one neuron to another. Okay. Now, the other point to make is that these neurons are often in different types of shapes and sizes. All right. So you see some which are very long and very kind of elongated, and some are very squashed and have a lot of branching. All right. So they're not all the same. Right. So the point really is that they all have general specialized structures depending on what their function is. And I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail with this because it gets quite complicated.
Student announcement. If Gundarj Gill from 7M is still on the premises, please come to the school office. Gundarj Gill from 7M, please come to the school office. Thank you.
Okay, so I mentioned one of the important aspects about neurons are the connections between two neurons. Okay, and the connections between the two neurons are called synapses, right? And the term synapse was coined by this guy here, a guy called Charles Sherrington, in the early 1900s. And basically, he sent this quote, which I'm showing you above here. And he decided what he was trying to describe here is that he felt that the connection between one neuron and another isn't simply just a physical connection. It's also a functional connection as well. And he didn't want to just call it a connection, as you would say, a connection in a pipe or something like that. He wanted to call it something else. And that's where he came up with the word synapse. And he came up with that word from Greek using two words, syn for together and haptin for to clasp. And the reason, and then from that syn and haptin, he came up with the word synapse. All right. And the reason he wanted to kind of emphasize that is to highlight the fact that it's not only a physical connection, it's a functional connection that's going on between two neurons as well. And later on, I'll kind of highlight the importance of that functional connection in terms of how that works. So now we've highlighted these synapses. The question then is, well, why are they important? What's the point of these things? Well, it's estimated that there's about 100 billion neurons within the average human brain. Okay, so that's quite a lot of kind of neurons which are present in all your brains at the moment. And with each neuron itself, it's thought that there's about 1,000 to 10,000 synaptic connections on each neuron. Okay, and just to highlight that, you can see that in this picture here. So you've got two neurons here highlighted, stained in green, and you notice there are these pink dots. Each pink dot represents a single synaptic connection on that neuron. So you can see that there are lots of connections on that neuron happening all at the same time. Okay, so therefore, if you add on how many neurons there are on the brain, you can probably guess how many synapses or connections there are on the brain. So it's thought there's approximately about 100 trillion synapses forming or firing in your brain at one time. All right, so there's a lot of these things going on all at the same time. These types of connections are happening all the time. Okay, so they're very important for general communication between neurons. So the question then is, this is a really big number. You know, how do you actually try to kind of conceptualize this type of number? Because it's so massive. All right. One way is to think of it by counting pennies. So we assume that one penny here is about 1.6 millimeters in thickness. If we pile 16 pennies up in a column, you've got something about 2.54 centimeters, which is about an inch. Okay. If we keep piling them up, and we pile up 1 million pennies, you get something which is about 1.5 meters high. Okay? If we still kind of build these up to get towards 100 billion or 100 trillion. So if you have a 1 billion pennies, you get a cube which is about 11 feet or 3.3 meters high. Okay. And then if you're looking at 100 billion pennies, so this would be how many neurons there are estimated to be in the normal human brain, right? You would have a cube which is about 126 feet high or 38.4 meters high. Okay. And this is from an American website, so it gives you the relative size of this on an American football field, right? So it's a huge number of actual individual neurons which are present in your brains at one time, just to emphasize that kind of vast number. Okay, that's fine, but what about 100 trillion? What does 100 trillion look like? Okay, so basically that would be, just to kind of highlight that again, if you're looking at a bigger cube on the left here, which has a height of 273 feet or 82.2 meters, that represents 1 trillion pennies. All right, so we're not even anywhere near 100 trillion synapses at this point. Okay, so it gives you an idea of the vastness of this number. And to try to contextualize this in terms of volume, what you've got here on the right here is a building, the Empire State Building in New York, represented in volume by how many pennies would be needed to fill it. Okay, so it's estimated that to fill the entire Empire State Building, you need 1.8 trillion pennies. All right, so that would be needed to fill the entire volume of the Empire State Building. So you would actually need about 50 of these to represent how many synaptic connections there are going on within the average human being. Okay, so it's a really big number in terms of what's actually going on. Okay, so the question then is, we know there are a lot of these synaptic connections being formed. Why are they important? Why does it matter? And the reason is, most normal brain function requires the formation or activity at this synaptic connection. Okay, and it's when you lose these synaptic connections that things start to go wrong. Okay. Oops. And it's needed basically for communication between different neurons within the brain. It's needed for normal development of the brain. Okay. Oops. And it's needed for the formation of learning and memory. So basically, your memory is dependent on how well these synapses form within your brain itself. So it's these synapses which are helping allow you to form those memories. Okay? So that's why it's really important to maintain the functioning of these synapses. And we now know that a lot of kind of neurological diseases, when they start, one of the first things that starts to go wrong is you start to lose the normal functioning of these synaptic connections. And that's why this is quite important in terms of how it functions. At the moment, we're trying to figure out why these things start to go wrong and how to detect when they start to go wrong normally within the brain. And that's the main kind of effort at the moment, to try to figure this out. Now, just to kind of give you a general kind of overview of this. So at birth, you don't have many synaptic connections going on. All right. But you notice that once you get to about 6 years old, there are lots of connections going on between neurons. And the reason for that is that you're starting to experience different things as you're starting to grow up. Okay. And once you get to your teenage years, you start to kind of refine that map, because you know what's important and what's not important, right? So you start to reduce the number of connections, okay? Because you know which ones are the important ones to allow you to function normally and develop. Now, unfortunately, when you get to my age, we start to lose our connections, and there's not much we can do about it. We will gradually start, once you get to a certain age, you start to lose those connections. And that's why the problem in terms of the formation of those synaptic connections is really important in terms of maintaining normal neuronal function. So hopefully this is just a short video summarizing what's actually going on in the synapse, and hopefully this will play.
We're going to be looking at these electrical impulses, these flashes, which are called action potentials, are crossing 3 neurons in the circuit here. And as we look in higher power, you can see it crosses the synapse, moves on to the next neuron in the circuit, crosses another synapse, finally activates the next neuron in this chain. And if we begin to focus at slower speeds and at higher magnification, we're going to focus on the information transfer at that single synapse. And so there is the dendrite on the right, the synaptic terminal on the left, and as the impulse information comes down, these little green discs are channels in the synaptic terminal that open. They let calcium ions into the nerve terminal. Calcium ions then activate small packets of neurotransmitter, which release their contents into the gap of this synapse. Some of them diffuse away, but others activate receptors on target neurons. They open yet further channels, which let sodium ions in, and so this information transfer propagates from one neuron to the next along these connections.
So that just gives you a general overview about what's actually happening at the synapse itself. How does one neuron actually cause something to change in the other neuron? And basically, that's a process what's known as synaptic transmission. And so therefore, that kind of process is how it's thought that learning and memory is thought to develop and occur. So it's that strengthening of that communication between two neurons is what is giving you that kind of link between memory.
We're going to be looking at...
Okay, so moving away from the basic biology, what I'm going to do now is move towards what we mean by memory itself. Okay, so this is going to be slightly less, more focused on the general mechanisms of the memory process and what do we actually mean by that. And you probably thought, well, how do you know some people have better memories than others? How do they go about trying to do that? Okay, and there are people have different kind of mechanisms and strategies of working these things out, and there isn't really a set way. It's basically what works best for you. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just generally kind of break down what we mean by learning and what we mean by memory itself. So learning is the process which we use to acquire information around us. Okay? How we're able to acquire that information. Okay? And memory is basically the process how we're able to retain that type of information. Okay? Once we're able to acquire it. Okay? Those are kind of general definitions of those two terms. And often they're linked together because we often need one to form the other. So the question then is, how do we actually try to break down memory? Memory itself is formed during different phases, there are different types. And what I'm going to do is just kind of give you a general overview of the different types of memory and how it's actually broken down itself. So the first thing is there's something which is known as immediate memory. Okay? And it lasts for a very, very short period of time, in more or less seconds. Okay? It's got a huge capacity, right? We can keep learning this very quickly. And in a way, it's a type of thing that happens when you walk into a room that you're not familiar with. First thing you do is you notice where the obstacles are, right? Because you don't want to go around walking into them. You know where you need to sit down. Those are things that you're kind of noticing what's going on. And that's what we mean by kind of immediate memory. And basically, the other way is the ability to kind of hold the ongoing experience within a short period of time. It's also the type of thing which happens, for example, when you're talking from one person to another. When you're talking, one person is talking, the other person is listening. When you're listening, you need to retain what that person has just said to you for a very short period of time, and then you need to process that to understand it. Okay? That is happening without you actually thinking about it. Okay? But that is what we mean by that kind of immediate memory. That's happening very quickly, and you're not really noticing it. Okay? So, for example, the ability to talk, right, and listen that information, therefore, when the spoken words come to you into your head, you're thinking about that, and then you think, oh, okay, now I understand. Okay, now it's obviously not going in that kind of slower pace, it's going much quicker than that, but that is basically what's happening in that case. Okay. The other thing to the next stage is something which is known as short-term or working memory. Okay. And that lasts for a bit longer, minutes, sometimes hours, but again, it's temporary. Okay. And it's very limited. It's got a limited capacity. You can only save about a dozen things in there. Okay? And the one way of thinking about this is how many digits are there in a typical mobile phone number? 11. Okay, why do you think they've made it only about 11? Because it makes it easier to remember. Okay? They're using the idea that that way you're going to store that information. If someone tells you that number, you can remember that number until you have the time to write it down and keep it safe, right? So you're using short-term memory to try to process that kind of information, right? And that's the reason why phone numbers are only limited to 11 digits, right? If it gets any longer, you're going to have trouble remembering that. And that's the reason why that happens, okay? But obviously, nowadays we have all our phones, and we don't really need to do that. But in the old days, without mobile phones, you have to rely on your own memory to remember what numbers were. Okay. Now, the other thing about this short-term memory is that it requires repetition. Okay. So, in a way, when you're cramming for an exam, that is what you're using. You're using your short-term memory. That's why it needs repetition, and that's why it only lasts for a limited period of time. You're using a short-term memory. Okay? Now, the more mysterious one is the long-term memory. That's the one that everybody wants to figure out. Okay? Now, this type of long-term memory lasts for eons, ages, and it's very permanent. The issue really is how do you actually put things into long-term memory? That's where it gets difficult. Okay, it's got a huge capacity. We probably don't use all of our brains to do this. Okay, and basically we're not quite sure how this actually works. We think there are some structural changes or some biological changes, cellular changes within the neuron, which is triggering these types of processes. May involve kind of changes in protein synthesis or cellular structure, but something is happening which is storing that type of long-term memory. But the issue at the moment is that we don't really know where this actually exists. We just know it is there. We just don't know where. Okay. So, how do we link these different types of memories together? So this is just a diagram showing the immediate memory, the working memory, and the long-term memory, and how they're all linked together. Okay, so you see that immediate memory can then go on to be working memory, and in some ways the working memory can then go on to lead to long-term memory. But the issue that really people want to know is how do you get to long-term memory? Because that's really what you really want. So basically, it's known you need repetition, right? You need repetition of the working memory to put that information into long-term memory. That is why you get told when you have an exam coming up, you have to revise. That is basically the idea between them. Okay? And that requires this process which is known as consolidation. That is what they mean by the repetition that's needed. Okay? And basically, this process known as consolidation is needed to convert this short-term memory, which you've memorized for, say, a couple of minutes or a couple of hours, into long-term memory where it sits in your brain forever. Okay? And that is the process which is more mysterious to us, and we're still trying to figure out. The other thing is to emphasize that memory itself has lots of different type of guises. And I'm going to talk about the different types. You have types which are known as declarative memory. That's basically the memory of facts and places and events. All right, that's your typical kind of memory you learn in your classroom. And then you've got something which is known as non-declarative memory. Okay, these are things you do automatically. You don't really have to think about it, but once you've learned to do it, you know how to do it. Okay, so it involves things like automatic tasks, right? For example, learning to play an instrument, okay, or learning to play football or hockey, something like that, or riding a bike. Those are kind of automatic tasks that you learn, or learning how to tie your shoelaces. These are automatic tasks that you develop, right? This is what we mean by non-declarative memory, because it doesn't involve a place or a time, but it is still memory. Right? You're still learning how to do these things, okay? And then also it's things like if you smell something and you're especially hungry, you are hungry, it reminds you, oh yes, I know exactly what that is. That would be all covered as kind of non-declarative memory. Or you have an emotional response to an environment that you've previously had a fearful kind of encounter, right? For example, exposure to a dangerous animal or something like that. That will all kind of be considered non-declarative memory. Okay. Oops. You got it. And for example, if you are involved in dance or learning dance, you might have heard this idea of learning muscle memory. That's kind of learning how to do a certain procedure. That is what we'd also cover as non-declarative memory. Okay? Now, I'm not going to focus too much on the non-declarative memory. I'll focus more on the declarative memory today, just because of time. Okay, so what do we mean by declarative memory? Now, declarative memory also is split into different parts as well. It's also referred to as explicit memory. And basically, it's the memory of facts and experiences and events. Okay? So that could be stuff you learn from reading, events you learn from experiences, for example, what happens on holiday, or what happens during a certain occasion, and events that are linked to periods of time, so linked to days in the calendar, right? That's all kind of considered declarative memory. And as I mentioned, it applies to standard textbook learning. And the thing is, this information can be forgotten, okay? But if you access it regularly enough, you will remember this forever. So, for example, if you go into an environment that you haven't been to for a long period of time, you will remember it, okay? So even though you haven't really thought about it for a while, it may kind of trigger a memory when you kind of be exposed to that environment again. Now, this memory itself can be subdivided into different forms. They're called episodic or semantic memory. Okay? And what do we mean by episodic? Basically, that's to do with a period of time, an event that happens. Okay? So basically, it's linked to a period of a moment in time or place. Okay? And it's tied to explicit events. So, for example, who remembers what they had for breakfast today? Yeah? Okay, you can remember today. Do you remember what you had for breakfast last week? If it's always the same, it's always going to be remembered. But it's the type of thing, you remember it because you know you've had it at a certain period in time. Okay? And also things like, do you remember where you went for your last holiday? What was the experience like? What was the weather like? Okay? So that is kind of linked to episodic memory. It's linked to a period in time. Okay? So, for example, what happens when the weather was bad or when the weather was good? Okay? What kind of you link that, you remember things in terms of episodic memory. And in certain cases, it's thought that people with very good memory are able to link this episodic memory with their somatic memory. Okay, so it's not completely clear how that goes about, but it's things that people are able to do. Now, the thing with this type of memory, it's a one-shot event. Once you get exposed to it, you generally always remember it. Okay, it's some case in time. Okay, so for example, if you're exposed to particularly good weather associated with a particular event, you will always remember that for a certain period. Now, semantic memory is the other type of memory, and this is basically what you're doing when you're revising. Right? This is your memory of revising, learning factual knowledge, which is independent of time. You're just learning things from the textbook. That's what we mean by semantic memory. Now, the issue here is that it's not easy to remember. You have to do it repetitively. This is where the revision comes in. Okay? And basically, it's the knowledge of facts and words. And it's abstract. It's not tied to a particular place in time. Okay? So this is basically what you're doing for your typical kind of textbook learning or revision. So the question then is, okay, we have these different types of memory. How do we know which brain systems actually underlie these types of processes? Okay. And we know this from this guy here, a guy called Henry Mollison. Okay. He's also known as patient HM. Okay. And basically, the information that scientists were able to understand from him by observing him for the last kind of 50 years of his life gave us a lot of information about how memory is formed in the brain. So the story of HM is quite a sad story. So when he was a teenager, he suffered horrendously from epileptic seizures. And at the time, the surgeon, at the time, the main kind of way of curing these things was removing part of the brain. And basically, that's what happened. He had part of the brain removed. Basically, the area that's highlighted in red on this diagram was whipped out. Right? It's quite a big part of the brain. Okay. And the thing is, that part of the brain also included a region, which I mentioned earlier, called the Hippocampal Formation. Okay, so they whipped that out at the same time without realizing what was going on. And he survived, and it cured his seizures. And just to highlight this, what you've got here on the left is HM's brain. You can see the grooves which have been dug out, removed. On the right, you've got normal brain. So you can see what bits of the brain have been removed from his brain, and he's still able to function. Okay, so it's actually quite a big piece of brain that they removed. The question then is, however, he then started to develop something called anterior grade amnesia. He basically wasn't able to develop new memories very well. And what I've got here is that there's a short radio documentary published by the American National Public Radio, which you can download freely from the web, where they did some interviews with him. Okay, so hopefully this will work.
When you're not at MIT, what do you do during a typical day?
See, that's what I don't remember things.
Uh-huh. Who is the president of the United States now?
That I couldn't tell you. I don't remember exactly at all.
Is it a man or a woman?
I think it's a man.
His initials are GB.
George
Does that
Bush
help?
at the time.
No, it doesn't. No.
Next one.
Do you know what you did yesterday?
No, I don't.
How about this morning?
I don't even remember that.
Could you tell me what you had for lunch today?
I don't know, to tell you the truth.
Peter? That's nice.
What do you think you'll do tomorrow?
Whatever's beneficial.
Good answer. Are you happy?
Yes. Well, the way I figure it is, what they find out about me helps them to help other people.
So that just gives you kind of some brief kind of snippets of what his life was like. He basically could not develop any new memories after the actual operation. And the last one is quite touching because basically he knew that people were observing him because in order to find out more about the memory process. He was quite happy to kind of help out because he knew what the implications were in terms of what was going on.
Can I just ask, did he get that over time, or was it soon after when they
It was
removed
lost straight. Okay, so it's worth. I've given at the end of this the links to the documentary are there, so you can always have a listen to it. And basically, there was a professor from MIT who kind of followed him for the rest of his life and interviewed him to see how he kind of developed his experiences.
Was that the only side effect he got? Was the large chunk of his brain that was removed?
That was my understanding. That's the main side effect. He just could not develop a new memory. Okay, so it's a very weird exception. That's why he studied so much in terms of neurobiology and psychology because of this unique case. In terms of what actually happened to him, what we think has happened is that we think that his immediate memory works. He has no problem learning things kind of immediately, and he can store it for short periods of time. And his working memory also works. He can actually perform kind of working memory, short memory tasks. He just can't remember anything over long periods of time. So the theory is that what's gone wrong in HM is that he's actually lost the ability to consolidate that memory into long-term memory. Okay? And basically the conclusion from the actual removal of that part of the brain, it tells you it involves this hippocampal formation. This is needed for the consolidation process. And the thing is, the really weird thing is that everything that happened before the operation, he remembers. No problem. So basically, his long-term memory is absolutely fine. Okay? He just can't make any new long-term memory because he's not able to generate that consolidation process to convert that short-term working memory into long-term memory. Okay? So, as I said before, we don't know exactly where this long-term memory is located. This is the big mystery. We're still trying to work on this to figure out where this is located. So I don't have any kind of good answers. Okay, but the thing is, just what we're able to kind of observe from the examples of what happened to him gives us a lot of insight into how the process actually occurs. Okay, so just as a general summary, what we've done here, I've given a general overview about the brain and neurons. I've gone through a general quick run through of different stages of memory. And I've talked a bit about what we mean by declarative and non-declarative memory and the distinctions between them. And then I've introduced patient HM, and I've given you some, shown you some kind of audio files of him speaking and his experience. So it's worth kind of looking at the documentary done on him, because it's quite an interesting kind of insight into his life at that time. So these are just some general questions to think about. You don't have to answer them at the moment, but you could think about things like, what could you do to try to improve your memory? I'm not expecting you to give me an answer now, just things to think about or afterwards. Can you think of diseases that you've heard about which are associated with the brain? And also, this is more of a kind of ethical thought. Do you think it was ethical for the surgeon to actually treat HM epilepsy in the way it was done? Was it ethical for him to be exposed to that kind of surgical procedure with the kind of consequences it had on his life later on? But these are just things to think about. Okay. Right. So, in terms of further reading, the British Neuroscience Association has produces a free kind of booklet on the brain. It's just kind of a short primer aimed at A-level students. It's freely available from BNA, and the website is here. It downloads as a PDF. It has basically, it's written by the experts in the field, but they've summarized a lot of things that are going on in the brain in kind of 2 pages. Okay, so it goes beyond what I've covered here. It goes into all sorts of kind of detail in terms of neuronal function and some of the research that's involved in this process. If you want to listen to the radio documentary, the website from National Public Radio is here. Don't worry about writing it down, because I think I've given the slides to LATSI, so they will be kind of made available to everyone. Okay, so you can click on those, and those it's quite an interesting kind of documentary to listen to. Okay, and I think that's my last slide. Yeah, so I think otherwise, just thank you very much for listening.
Why does grey matter decrease as you age? Grey matter in the brain, why does it decrease?
It's thought that the grey matter basically contains the neurons. Okay, so it's thought that what's happening here is that, you know, I mentioned that the synapses start to decrease as you get older. Your neurons basically aren't going to last forever. Okay, once you get to a certain age, right, your neurons start to decrease, and also you don't develop new ones. Okay, so that number starts to decrease over time because the cells can't regenerate.
The person you spoke about, how long does memory loss? Like in the interview, she asked him, "Will you eat in the morning?" He couldn't reply to that. So how long do you think remember?
I think he probably he was able to learn tasks, right, for maybe an hour or so, but he couldn't remember things for longer than that. That's my understanding. Okay, so it's an impairment that's quite kind of difficult. So if you, in the interviews from the interviewer herself, who's a professor at MIT in Boston, she actually would often go into the room and he wouldn't remember who she was, even though she had already met him several times. He wouldn't remember. Okay, so that's how kind of difficult it was to kind of deal with. Alcohol. I think it depends on how you look at it. Alcohol has many, many different types of effects. Alcohol is a depressant. So what it does is, you know, the neuronal firing, it actually reduces that process between neurons. So basically it gets slower. Okay. And so therefore, that's why the effect of alcohol is. Now, some cases, it's only a temporary effect, but over chronic use, it will have kind of longer term kind of damage. that's how that.
Would HM have been aware that he had this issue?
Yeah. I think they know that he could not remember. He was aware he could not remember.
So he did take that on.
He was somehow able to that was able to he was able to make that association. That's my understanding. He was able to kind of realize that this was a problem, but he wasn't able to kind of remember kind of places. So he was able to learn certain, like when I mentioned that non-declarative memory, so tying your shoelace or doing motor tasks, he was able to learn that. That was no problem. Just he wasn't able to learn kind of places and people, recognize that kind of declarative memory. All right. I don't know. My kind of understanding about photographic memory is somehow some people are able to link their semantic memory, this is the memory for facts, with that kind of episodic memory. So basically you can associate those kind of facts with kind of images and pictures. And because that kind of episodic memory you remember very quickly and lasts for a long time, that's able to form a link. Okay? And it's thought that that's how that photographic memory is able to. So people with photographic memory, therefore, will have very good memories generally. Now, how that happens, it's not clear because we can't cut someone's head open and have a look. It's not something that we can do at the moment. But I'm not. So that's my understanding at the moment in terms of how that actually works. But I'm not word expert in that. Okay. Okay. Yeah. All right. All right. I'm just going to answer a few more questions. Yeah. Is that all right? Or yeah.
Did HM have passed away into surgery?
I don't know what my understanding. He more or less passed away of old age. It wasn't of a major kind of issue. Because basically he was put into a kind of a retirement home to look after him, because everyone knew that he had quite an important kind of situation. And my understanding from the biography is he died of old age. It wasn't of any kind of weird kind of necessary effect of surgery. So it's kind of odd.
Just at the beginning, you spoke of synapses, and at the age of 6, they're highly stimulated. They were fine. Now, I'm just thinking in terms of skills and occupation. Has there ever been a study depending on someone who's doing a specific occupation, their synapses are highly stimulated to someone who's in a totally different occupation, say someone who's a data analyst, for example, who's analysing a lot of data, someone who's physically, manually.
It's a good point. I don't really know, to be honest. I'm sure they might have done some studies, probably some MRI kind of studies to see which areas light up, but it's difficult to get into the resolution.
Would age be an impact here? Because obviously your occupation, you're at a certain age point, as you get older, you kind of refine your skills.
Yeah, it's quite possible. And therefore, that's also why, at your stage, that's why you're being made to learn all these things, because that's the stage where you need to learn these. Because when you get older, it gets harder for us to learn. Yes, they did. They did. Yes, they did do a study. That was, I know the person. Yeah, they were following how black children were able to memorize space and place, the roots.
So would you say that technology now, such as like, is slowing down the brain activity?
I don't know. I think you're looking at two different things going on here, because I think using technology, you're developing different skills, right, compared to dinosaurs. There are different skills involved, and that's what you're developing. So I think it's difficult to say whether you, it's like apples and pears. That kind of.
Well, I'd just like to say a big thank you from the Mountain for coming
Okay, thank you very much.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much.